Welcome to today's webinar, Serious Injury and Fatality Prevention, Lessons from Mosaic. During today's presentation, attendees will be in a listen-only mode. If during the program you would like to submit a question at any time, please use the chat pod located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. There you can type your question in the box at the bottom and click Send. If you have any technical difficulties, you may contact us at the Help Desk, and that number is 877-297-2901. Now I'll turn things over to Joy Inoue. Please go ahead, Joy.
Thank you very much, Chris. Welcome everybody to today's webinar on serious injury and fatality prevention. This webinar is presented by the Campbell Institute, which is the Center for EHS Excellence at the National Safety Council. If you're familiar with our webinars, what we usually try to do is present these very leading edge and provocative topics in EHS and get great speakers to do it. So today we have Taylor Abel of Mosaic to present on serious injury and fatality prevention and specifically what Mosaic is doing to prevent SIFs. So let me introduce Taylor Abel here. So Mr. Taylor Abel is a professional engineer and currently the Senior Manager of EHS Process Optimization at Mosaic. Over his career, Mr. Abel has worked closely with the key stakeholders to build sustainable EHS programs and integrate them into the business to drive a safer work environment, ensure compliance, and change culture. Mr. Abel has worked with the same organization his entire career from the site level to corporate governance and has gained experience in all parts of Mosaic's business, leading EHS at its surface and underground mining operations to its global supply chain. He has over 20 years of environmental, health, safety, and security experience, with over half of it in strategic senior leadership roles from senior manager to assistant vice president. Mr. Abel led the development of serious accident and fatality prevention at Mosaic. In 2015, he was the founding chairperson of the Saskatchewan Mining Associates Serious Accident and Fatality Elimination Work Group. Mr. Abel has dedicated his professional life to improving workplace safety and environmental stewardship. So without further ado, I will let Taylor take it over. Please, Taylor, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Joy, for that kind introduction. I'm Taylor Abel, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be sharing our experience with you today. Before we get started, I'd just like to take a minute and talk about the importance of serious injury and fatality prevention. Regardless of your organization, you have certain production goals or cost goals or deliverables that you have to achieve. And if you have a month where you don't make your production goals or you're over a little bit on cost, it's problematic for sure. But you can certainly recover and ultimately make it right. But when something goes wrong in the workplace and someone's seriously injured or worse, dies, you can't ever fix that. The permanence of one of those is irreparable. And it really makes the work that we do critically important and even noble in some regards. So with that backdrop, I'll proceed to the agenda. As Joy said, I work for the Mosaic Company. I'm going to provide you a little overview and context for the work that we do. And then I'm going to provide a background of the SIF thinking and concept and paradigm there. And then I'm going to share with you Mosaic's journey, look at data, and then we'll have a closing. If there are questions along the way, by all means, type them in and try to answer them. If not, we'll certainly have time at the end of the presentation to take some questions. So Joyce said, I work for the Mosaic Company, and we're the leading integrated producer of phosphate and potash fertilizers or crop nutrients. All plants need three nutrients. They need nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, and Mosaic's the world leading producer and marketer of two of these three. Our mission is to help the world grow the food that it needs. With an ever-increasing population as well as global prosperity, the amount of more that farms need to produce is estimated to be 70% more by the year 2050. And Mosaic will play a critical role in helping get the food that the world needs. A little background on who we are. We were formed in 2004. We were a combination of a company called IMC Global, International Minerals Corporation, as well as the fertilizer businesses from Cargill. Cargill spun off the fertilizer divisions, and we joined with IMC to create Mosaic, and that was back in 2004. We've got a rich history of mining and manufacturing in Florida and Canada. We make about 22 million tons of product a year, and as you can see, in 2016 we had just over $7 billion in sales. We ship around the world, and we have about 9,000 employees, predominantly in the U.S. and Canada, but also Brazil and some smaller operations internationally. Our operations consist of phosphate production in Florida, where we've got 4 open pit mines, and we mine phosphate ore that's roughly 50 to 100 feet deep. And then we make that phosphate available to the plants through chemical processes. We manufacture sulfuric acid, phosphoric acid, and a little bit of ammonia. And then we'll ship that material, finished product, throughout North America and around the world. We make potash. We mine potash fertilizer predominantly in Canada and Saskatchewan. We've got 2 underground mines there, and we've got a solution mine as well. We've got operations in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and Louisiana. And then we've got a distribution business where we ship and handle roughly 15,000 tons of material a day. We've got warehouses along the river system in the U.S., in Brazil, a little bit in Asia. And we ship a product at bulk, mainly rail and vessel. We do some trucking. So that's a little background on Mosaic and what we do, and I think it's important to understand the context. We're heavy industry in mining. So with that backdrop, I'm going to take a step back and talk about SIF, Serious Injury and Fatality Prevention, and provide a little background on that. In the early 1930s, Herbert Heinrichs, who worked for an insurance company, developed the loss pyramid, which I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar with. And Herbert reviewed a number of hundreds of incident reports and really categorized different incident types and came out with a ratio. And so that for every one major accident, there were a certain number of minor accidents, a greater number, and a certain greater number of no accidents. And his ratio that he developed in 1931 was 1 major accident to 29 minor accidents to 300. It's evolved over the years with a little more granularity, and the ratios vary too. They're really based on company specific, but the paradigm and the thought is the same, that there's a ratio that starts off small with the very severe accidents and gets much greater at the base of the pyramid with near misses. So the belief was that if you can reduce and eliminate the number of minor accidents and no accidents, you'll eliminate fatalities or lost time injuries from happening. As demonstrated here, you shrink the pyramid. And that, I think, was effective when there were very high injury rates. But what industry noticed in the past number of years, and a number of different organizations, that while their injury rates may be decreasing, their fatality rates were flat or even increasing. So the question is why? Why was this phenomena of the Heinrichs pyramid held true? Then companies should be having fewer fatalities, and the lines to really be parallel. But they weren't. Companies were experiencing flat or even increasing fatalities. So a number of years ago, a company, a BST corporation, started a study with 8 or 10 different companies to really try to answer this question. And what they came up with was that within Heinrichs pyramid, there is actually a subset of incidents that have the potential to be fatal or serious, to be life-altering. And so they looked at a number of hundreds of reports, maybe even thousands, and they came out with that 19% of recordable injuries with the companies in the first study group, so roughly 1/5 of recordables, have the potential to be life-altering or fatal. And that's a big number. And so some of the conclusions that they developed was that not all incidents have an equal probability of resulting in serious injury. Right? So if someone has a strain, typically the worst it's going to be. It's going to be a strain. Right? Kind of worst case scenario. Whereas if someone gets burned, a minor burn, well, it could be that, depending on the incident, they could have, had a very serious burn or life-altering burn. So it may seem obvious today that not all incidents have an equal probability of resulting in serious injury, but this helps to validate that. Likewise, incidents that involve certain types of work have a greater outcome for a greater loss of a fatality or lost time or life-altering injury. Certainly, doing manual dexterity with your hands has a much less risk than working from heights. So the study really concluded that a reduction at the bottom pyramid does not correspond to a reduction at the top of the pyramid. So when and more importantly, that the things you do to prevent an injury, minor injury, there has to be something different to produce a serious incident or fatality. So different intervention strategies. So it really turned Heinrichs pyramid on its head. And that's what we'll talk more about today. So Mosaic's SIF data, our journey really started off when we became Mosaic. In 2004, as I mentioned, we formed. Historically, Mosaic, and still does, use DNV loss control theories in preventing accidents and incidents. Certainly, we have had and have a good culture of near-miss reporting. We have we investigate incidents to make sure we understand the causes. We implement corrective actions to prevent reoccurrence, as a large number of organizations do. We also make programmatic improvements over that same time period. Now, unfortunately and tragically, during this 2004 to 2008 time period, we experienced a number of fatal accidents for a number of different reasons. And as a result, we took a lot of actions and made added controls and added safeguards to what we do. In 2009 timeframe, we pursued and ultimately obtained ISO registration. We wanted to have a more robust, more disciplined management system, and the registration helped to validate that effort. We also joined BST in their second round of working group with their serious incident and fatality prevention. And then in 2012 and to 15, we developed within Mosaic the concept of SIF, largely keeping that work within the safety professionals. We analyzed incidents going back several years to create a base, and then on an ongoing basis during that time period to develop data. We socialized the concept with our senior leaders, and then we did, most importantly, took action and targeted interventions. And then more recently, we refined and improved that process. We expanded it out to all of our operations and branded it as potentially serious incidents. We included an environmental potential element to try to look through potential of environmental situations with the same lens that we do on the safety side. And then, as I mentioned before, we deployed it across the organization. So I'll go into a little bit more detail of each area along the path, really starting with our work with BST in 2010 timeframe. So we defined a serious injury or fatality as such that certainly something that's life-threatening or requires emergent care, or something that someone had a permanent injury that was really life-altering. So relatively straightforward. Although we did have questions and discussions in brief about life-altering, you know, if something happened and you couldn't throw the baseball with your daughter, and we would consider that kind of life-altering, right? Affected your quality of life. To put some more color around that, and the slide may be a little hard to see, but we developed different categories for different types of incidents. So if an event had the potential to be fatal or life-altering, and it was associated with the items on this list, so for example, high pressure water blasting, then we would call that an SIF event. And we capture that and we put that in our analysis. Likewise, if we had an event that was excavation, someone was excavating and we didn't have safeguards and we had the potential for a fatal or life-altering injury, we would include that. What we determined at the time was not to include was falls from the same level. So if we had somebody that tripped on the same level, certainly it could be life-altering, but we decided to keep that out of the data. We had a walking working surfaces program that we were implementing and refining at the time and wanted to keep it separate. Likewise, hearing shifts, which certainly can affect quality of life and are life-altering. We recently improved our hearing conservation program, and we're capturing that separately. Likewise, if we were talking about an event and having discussion around is it a SIF event or not, if that discussion took more than 5 minutes, we said it's not an SIF event. They should be pretty clear-cut and pretty obvious to what they are. And I like to say you want the cream to rise to the top, and that's what we're looking to do here. So over the course of time, we got a lot of data, and we looked at some of that data. And as an example of some of the output, in this case we had falling objects where we had the greatest percentage of SIF events, and by an overwhelming margin. So from a corporate perspective, we said we needed to do something about that. And we developed an intervention around preventing falling objects, which we affectionately named Stop the Drop. We developed a corporate standard that defined the requirements. And then we created a communication strategy and something catchy so that people would remember it. and then trained employees on what those requirements are. I think more importantly, not only did we do that, we procured tools and items to make them successful, to set them up for success. So we got tethers for hand tools, we got netting for guardrails, we got signage, and had that all in place when we went live. Because we want to make safety easy for our employees. And then to continue to help, we conducted field checks and coaching and feedback, really to make sure people understand what the requirements are. And then ultimately we did, after that initial implementation, we did integrate it into our EHS management system for self-assessment checks. We also included it in our corporate audit program to make sure that we're on track with Stop the Drop. So that was an example of one of the interventions that we took. The data at some of the site data, folks took a more localized improvement activities. So for example, one of our underground mines around ground control of the mine, they created a workout team to help reduce the risk there. And that was something that could be done on a local level. So in this example of Stop the Drop, we've got something done corporately across the organization. And on a local level, we've got an example with improved ground control. And I think it's important that, if we didn't have the data or the information, we wouldn't necessarily have been able to take action until it became obvious and apparent around someone getting seriously hurt from a falling object or something else. So one of the questions that just came across, Michael shared that they have a high frequency of falling objects, but there were pieces of structure or lighting that were discovered by the worker, and how do we address those issues, or was it not an issue for our company? That's a great question, Michael, and I'll talk about it more as we get into the improvement and the refinement that we made around our Stop the Drop, around our prevention of falling objects. So I will definitely highlight and pinpoint that. So up until this point, we've largely been sharing the data within Environment, Health, and Safety group and within our senior leaders. But now it's time to really go big and communicate it externally. So with that, we did a number of things. And the first one was to rebrand it as serious incidents and potentially serious incidents. We wanted language that was accessible and understandable to the workforce. We wanted something that resonated more and believed that this terminology would accomplish that. We also wanted to emphasize potential and have folks look through the lens of what if something happened. And I think the only drawback is that the acronym PSI is used in a number of different, it's a common acronym around pounds per square inch or process safety information. So that's a little unfortunate, but it still really emphasizes the potential. So we also updated the definition of SIF and the categories, which is where Michael's question comes in. And then we expanded the determination to operations. So the plants and mines in real time would have to make a determination if something was an SIF or PSI event. Likewise, we communicated that across the company. And to make sure the plants and mines were accurately categorizing and making determinations appropriately, we created a quality assurance process, which I'll talk about in more detail. And likewise, we continue with our notices and investigations around these events. And this is when we added the SIF concept to environment. So I'm just going to share with you one of the communications that we sent out. And so around serious safety incidents, we say those are life-altering and they impact families, friends, and coworkers. And we want our workforce to understand that an incident doesn't necessarily impact them, but there's this ripple effect. It's a big ripple effect and wide ripple effect, and the impact is far-reaching. Similarly, on the serious environmental incidents, they can affect our license to operate a facility, part of a facility, or obtain permits in the future. Mosaic, we mine and we temporarily disturb the land. We reclaim our mine land acre for acre, and we've got world-class ecologists and biologists that help us accomplish this. That said, there's a lot of scrutiny, a lot of regulatory oversight in what industry does, and we have to make sure that we're flawless because it really can impact our ability to operate. And we want to make sure our workforce understands this. Similarly, serious incidents can affect our public image. Think of certainly with BP and the oil rig Horizon, that had obviously a huge impact on the public image. So incidents including near misses, minor incidents with the potential to have a serious consequence, these are free lessons, and we should treat them with the same importance as a serious incident. Unfortunately, I've had to investigate 2 fatal accidents, and I really don't wish that upon anyone. Not only is it all-consuming from a time perspective, but from an emotional perspective. And so when we have a potentially serious incident, we want to investigate that with the same rigor and depth as we would if it were really a fatality or life-altering injury. Similarly, with the free lesson concept, we want to make sure that our workforce understands this is not about blame. It's about understanding the root causes and eliminating the root causes. And it's a lot easier to do that around a potentially serious incident than an actual serious incident. And when we do our investigations, we even ask, if this outcome had been worse, will we be looking at it differently, or making sure that we dig deep and do some soul searching on understanding the root causes. And I think with that, there's a question from Vicki on how we handle notifications with our company when we do have a PSI event or an SI event. So we have an emergency notification process for real-time emergencies. And then beyond that, we do have a notification process within 24 hours of a potentially serious incident. There's a notice that's sent out to really all the operational leaders at all the sites throughout Mosaic, as well as senior and executive management, explaining what the incident was, current situation and condition. And then after the investigation, we follow up with a final notice as soon as the investigation is done, and we really put the expectation, certainly within a month, that we complete the investigation. And that notice will have the causes and corrective actions. And then we take that information and we put that in our incident information system to make sure we follow through those action items through completion. I think by having by sharing this information broadly, some sites actually will take action as if the incident happened at their site, and they'll implement those corrective actions even though it didn't, which is incredibly proactive. So in our different business units, we manage investigations differently. Wallace had a question around, do we have advanced investigator training for SIFs or PSIs? We do have select individuals that do investigate those incidents, and that's really the core of a bulk of what they do. we want to make sure we've got that expertise in order to have a thorough and thoughtful investigation. So there are a few more questions come in. I'm going to continue with the presentation for a moment. But the key here is really making sure that we communicate out why we're looking at serious and potentially serious incidents. We want to make sure people understand the why around it. So when we define a serious incident at Mosaic, we define that as those things which are life-altering or can affect our license to operate. And then we use the criteria as if we've got a risk assessment matrix that's used throughout the organization in different areas from finance to capital to management systems. And we wanted to line up with that existing risk assessment matrix. So we defined anything that resulted in an A or B level, which I'll show you in a moment, on a risk assessment matrix would be a serious incident. Or for a potentially serious incident, likewise an A or B on the RAM. But here's the caveat: if only one factor around the event was changed. And we're pretty broad on what we call one factor. It could be anything. So, for example, if you had a falling, something that fell on, that fell to the ground, if someone could have been underneath there, then that would be the one factor that changed the person's location, and we would call that a SIF or PSI event. We do get into this around lockout tagout as an example. So we've got a situation where there was a lockout that maybe wasn't done quite right, but you needed, to get the key, to unlock the locks, to take the locks off the equipment, to hit the start button, and to have somebody in harm's way. While problematic and significant, and we certainly investigate it, we wouldn't necessarily call that a PSI. We would capture that more as a near miss. On the flip side, if we had somebody that locked out the wrong equipment, well, then you've got only one thing that would be wrong, that one factor that could change to result in a potentially serious or fatality, and that would be classified as a PSI. So the Mosaic, the Mosaic RAM, we have, and they line up pretty well on the safety side, a fatality, but we also include a release of material that could be a threat. Typically, it would be a gaseous material. For us, it would be either ammonia or sulfur dioxide, which could impact members of the public or require someone to shelter in place. Would certainly be an A-level safety event. Likewise, B, a permanent disabling injury, or multiple people could be injured, would be B-level. On the environmental side, releases of material that pose a threat to the environment, or regulatory noncompliance with a localized impact on the environment that may take months or even years to remediate, would be fall in that A and B category. So there's a question from Bailey about if we've had discussions reconciling our SIF definition with OSHA's serious injury reporting definition. We did early on, and we wanted to focus on kind of what was more relevant for Mosaic, and really kind of get to the human side of of a life-altering injury. So we did have those discussions, but we decided to keep it customized within Mosaic. I would recommend that you got to do what kind of right and works for your organization. With that, we updated our categories when we changed and refined our PSI process. And this gets back to Michael's questions. So hopefully you can see it on the screen there. But falling objects, we ended up splitting into 3 different areas. So we've got falling objects around lifting, falling objects around unsecured, which would really be the Stop the Drop campaign. And then we've got falling objects around our structural equipment, which I think was what you were getting at, Michael, with your question around light fixtures or flakes of concrete that may be found on the floor. So in those cases, because someone found them, obviously somebody could be there and have been impacted by the falling structural objects, and we certainly would call those PSI event. Mosaic several years ago instituted a structural integrity program to help us address that. So that's the intervention that we've got from a structural standpoint. And over the years, we've had to expand that, and it's interesting to bring up light fixtures because initially they were out of the scope of that structural program, but over capturing the information around our SIF or PSIs, we've actually incorporated light fixture inspections to make sure that they don't fall. So we have a quality assurance process. Sorry, just one other comment on the category. So, we've had the question of is there an incident that may fall into more than one category? So, for example, if you've got mobile equipment working near overhead power line, and what we've done in those cases is to say, okay, what's the proximal or immediate hazard? And in this case, it will be the overhead power line, and we would categorize it in that bucket, in that category. So we only put things in one category, and it's really just and we picked a category that will pose the greatest hazard. So, whereas if you've got people walking around mobile equipment, then we would put that in our mobile equipment category. So there is, quite a bit of discussion around, which category, because it's important data and we want it to be accurate. And so the sites, as I mentioned before, will in real time review and make a determination if an event is PSI, and they'll figure out which category, and then they'll make the notice and start securing the scene from an investigation standpoint, and then follow up through closure of corrective actions. The business unit on a monthly basis will conduct a review, and this review is done with the EHS professionals once a month, and they'll look at all the items that were marked PSI, and they'll look at the categories to make sure that they were determined correctly. So really looking for those false positives. Likewise, there's a number of incidents that were not identified as PSIs, and we'll strategically select those. We'll look for keywords such as lockout, falling, confined space, and review a sample of those to make sure that we didn't miss any PSIs that should have been PSIs, looking for those false negatives. And the other thing that this quality assurance process does, it really helps the EHS professionals to get aligned and deepen their understanding. Ultimately, they're the kind of the expert at the sites to help the sites make the determination. And it's a really good forum to have discussions and make sure we're calibrated and use it as a teaching moment. And then corporate group will do the same thing, just on a less frequent scale, obviously with a smaller sample size. But it's important that we've got good data it's important that we're making decisions off those data. So there was a question if we deployed the process at non-production sites from Teresa, and we do deploy it at our non-production sites. The good news is they have far fewer incidents or near misses. So sometimes we may have to do a little hand-holding and help them along the way, but they know enough to certainly make the initial reports. That's a good question. Thank you. So from a data standpoint, talk about the data and using the data to make a safer workplace. And I'm going to kind of go back to the previous concept of the decreasing RIFR rate. So here's an example of a decreasing RIFR over time. And this would be the recordables that are PSI. So this would be a potentially serious RIFR, a PSI RIFR. And you can see that that bottom line is largely flat. There's a slight decrease to it, but it's generally pretty flat, whereas the RIFR, is clearly decreasing. Before we had our PSI concept and before we had the data, we might be thinking that we're really creating a much safer work environment, where the fact of the matter is we still have exposure to serious incidents out there in the workplace. And without that information, we wouldn't be able to make changes or improvements or add controls. So it's really, really useful for us. And then, I think interestingly, if you look at the RIFR rate, it lines up, moderately well with that 20% that BST identified in some of their preliminary research. And again, this is just some demonstrated data. We also look at a PSI rate with our that includes near misses, and so that number typically is because there are more incidents, is a little bit higher. We don't try to react on a monthly basis. We try to be more strategic in how we respond and react to the data. So we'll look at trends, and then likewise previously we also look at some of the categories. One of the things that Mosaic has done is to really look at all of our safety programs, and based on the work that we've done around SIF and PSI, we've identified really 10 programs that, from a corporate perspective, we're making more robust. We want to, and we are in the process of carving those out and calling them life critical to really emphasize that, hey, this work has the potential, if not done correctly, to be life altering. And so we identified these 10 based on our PSI work. We've got things around lifting operations or lockout tagout, as you'd expect, and we also have working around water, which you might not expect, but there's a lot of risk there. So these are administrative programs, they're administrative controls, but in there are requirements for engineering controls, ideally eliminating the risk altogether, or if not, or the hazard, if not substituting safer chemicals or whatnot. So we want to make sure that when we look at interventions and controls, we look at our hierarchy of controls, obviously trying to eliminate the hazards as they exist. So in summary, and then we'll get to some questions, I started off the discussion here talking about the importance of SIF. And this graph, this chart here is an example. This would be around confined space, And the data there it's all near-miss data. Most of the blue data is non-PSIs. The red data would be a PSI near-miss. And I think the important thing is that a lot of times we don't get a second chance around potentially high-risk work. And by ferreting out, PSIs and being able to identify them, we're able to take action before they materialize into a fatality or a life-altering injury. So it's a critical concept that has really helped us transform how we think and how we look at incidents and spend our time. I think one of the discussion points we had early on was that we want to prevent all injuries. Right? The challenge is we don't want to have a disproportionate amount of time and energy spending minor injuries. We want to make sure that we're doing them both and that we're spending time and energy commensurate to the risk. So it's not a one or the other. It's really both. And by pulling out the SIF data, you can create separate interventions and improvements to create a safer work environment. So for your own organizations, you got to figure out what makes sense on the definition of a SIF or PSI, and maybe that's the OSHA definition of a serious injury. Look at the data, analyze the data, use the data. The data will point you in the right direction, and most importantly, take action, I think. And then lastly, an old colleague of mine always said, you always reserve the right to get smarter and get better. So take time to refine the process and make improvements to the process as necessary. So with that, I'd like to thank Campbell Institute for the opportunity to share this, and I'll take some questions, which are out there.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, for the presentation. We do have some questions up here. As I let you, write some more of your questions into the box, I just want to mention really quick that some of you had asked about the availability of the presentation after today, and this is being recorded. The entire webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be up available online after today, so you'll be able to view it again should you wish. I'm not sure about the availability of the PowerPoint slides. I'll let Taylor answer that question. Would you be willing to make the PowerPoint slides available, or is the webinar recording good enough?
No, I'll work with you, Joy, to make it available.
Okay. All right. So there you go. There's your answer for the PowerPoint slides. We'll find a way to make them available to the audience. All right. So let's take a look at some questions here, and we have a lot coming in, and I'll try to get some of the ones that came in earlier here. So here's a question here. So does Mosaic have two separate standards, one for SIS and one for minor injuries?
Good question. So we do have, I would say, two standards. For SIF events, the formality and the rigor of the investigation is greater than for non-SIF or PSI events. So if we've got, say, a minor near miss, we'll work really very limited on a minor corrective action. If we've got a recordable, we'll typically do we want to learn from recordable injuries that are not PSI as well, and we will do a RCA on those. And then for the PSIs, we really just add more resources to the investigation.
Great. We have another question here. Have you established metrics and goals for each location, and what root cause methodology do you use for SIF incidents?
So we use think reliability, root cause analysis as our methodology and approach. We do not have PSI targets, and that's actually deliberate. We want to make sure that we are gathering the data, and we don't want to influence a determination one way or the other by trying to set targets. For us, the real value is the interventions, right? What actions are we taking to really reduce risk in the workplace? What controls are we adding and improving? And that's really what we look at. So we don't have PSI targets. At this stage in the game, I would caution our senior leaders into creating targets for it. But it's something that we certainly monitor, and we want to look at trends and direction if we're improving or not improving. So long answer is no, we don't have targets.
Another question. Do you identify SIF potential strictly via incident investigation, or do you conduct behavior-based type observations based upon the SIF precursors?
That's a really wonderful question. The short answer, we do not tie it into the precursors or behaviors around the investigation or around the event. I think it's an opportunity that we will need to look at, and so some of those precursors might be, how many people are working on the job, as one example, right? So if we have a job that has, if there are 3 people involved in a job, is that statistically significant with regard to SIF? That could be a precursor, and we may want to take extra action or add additional safeguards to understand that whenever we have 3 people working, we've got a greater potential for a serious incident. So that's an area that we've not done much or a lot in, and I would say that's probably our next opportunity to add rigor, add depth to our program here.
Great. We had a couple of questions regarding contractors, and so here's one that I think encapsulates kind of a couple of different questions. Do you handle contractor SIF potential or events differently than your own?
At this stage in the game, we really don't. They're included in our performance metrics from a recordable standpoint. So we do gather their incidents, and we do investigate them as well. And so kind of treat them the same as we do our employees. I do know there are some discussions around potential co-employment issues with that and contractors. But at this point in the game, we believe that it's a good and right thing to do to understand what could have almost caused someone to die. So we're going to focus on doing that. So yes, we do include them.
Another question here on investigation.
Sorry, one other thing, Joy. On the contractor side, they do their own investigations as well, and they may have actions within their organization that they have to take. We don't necessarily track some of those actions, but anywhere Mosaic's involved, we put those in our system. Track those.
Great. Here's a question here. When you complete a final investigation report and circulate it within 30 days, do you feedback loop those that were received and considered for applicability, or maybe take a subset of the final report for significant injuries or PSIs?
That's a really good question. So right now what we do is we'll do we're in a little bit of a transformation right now, and with regard to corrective actions from a report or feedback from a report, those are largely done at the site, and then we do have discussions with our operations leaders to determine if any of those action items, corrective actions, may be applicable at the other sites, and then we do work to create those or add those controls at the extra sites We have monthly business review meetings where we have those discussions. We have a few minutes for those discussions. The EHS team will tee up a select few that, based on our professional experience, believe are most impactful and most applicable across the business segment, and then we'll present that in those meetings.
I have a question here. I think it's probably related to that Stop the Drop campaign that you mentioned, Taylor. The question is, we also have a high frequency of falling objects, but these were pieces of the structure or lighting that was discovered by a worker during rounds. How did you address those issues, or was this not an issue for your company?
Yeah, I touched on a little bit in the discussion. But certainly, it is an issue, absolutely, because those pieces obviously could cause a very serious injury or worse. So in our refinement, we broke out falling objects into 3 different categories, into falling objects with loads, whether it be hoists or cranes, falling objects with unsecured objects, so tools or anything that could fall out of a hand. And that was really the focus of our Stop the Drop program. And then we've got the 3rd category around structural, falling objects around structural. And we do have really built a very robust structural integrity program here at Mosaic, and are spending significant capital to prevent those objects from falling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Here's another question. Do you provide advanced investigator training to your investigators for SIS and PSI?
We do. We do, yes. So again, we use Think Reliability. And a large part of that is we have a few folks that will facilitate and investigate those PSI events. So they've got that expertise because they're doing it more frequently than somebody at the site that might do an investigation once every month or 2.
A question on software. What internal system, if any, do you use to collect incidents for the purposes of classification and analysis?
So our information system is a company called Ventive, which used to be part of AM Risk Console. And then we'll take, we can do limited reporting, really no analysis in there. So we use Minitab, and we've got some green belts and black belts, 6 Sigma green belts and black belts that will do deeper dive analysis via Minitab.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. I'm trying to skip around. What does the water category cover? And that means, what kinds of water incidents does Mosaic have that, or that you have had that are of concern?
Sure. So we have mining here in Florida, open pit mines, and those processes are pretty water intensive, and in both the mining as well as reclamation. And the risk there is drowning, frankly. And tragically, we've experienced a couple drownings.
Another quick question here before we get to the top of the hour. Are you able to share your Stop the Drop campaign materials?
I would think so, yes. I would think so. I have to QC that internally, but I
right.
Generally, being a member of the Campbell Institute, want to support other companies in their safety journey. So with that, I'd be happy to share my contact information as well if anybody has any other follow-up questions.
Right. So that was another question. If you could provide your contact information. I don't know if you want to state it here now, or if we can make that available on the webinar recording.
You can make it available on the webinar recording, or I can do it now. I can.
So to the audience members, we will be able to provide Taylor's contact information, the PowerPoint slides, and also that you'll be able to receive a link to this recording later. We are at the top of the hour, so I do want to thank Taylor very much for his time, for volunteering so graciously to give this webinar for us. We do want to plug, of course, the NSC Congress and Expo. We have a few events that take place during the Congress and Expo in Indianapolis. This will be at the end of September, September 25 through 27 will be the dates of our events. On all of our events, from the Executive Forum to the 2 workshops that we hold on September 27th, or 26th I should say, are a focus on SIF prevention, different topics there. So if you're interested, please go to congress.nsc.org to register, and we hope to see you in Indianapolis. So thanks very much everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Taylor, and everyone have a safe day.
Great. Thank you, Joy. Thanks for the opportunity. Is there the evaluation?
Yes, thank you all for joining us for the webinar, and we do appreciate your attention and participation in today's event. To assist us in future webinars, please do fill out the short survey which is currently on your screen. Thank you again for attending the webinar, and have a great day, everyone.